On April 2nd, 2026, a pilot preparing to fly from Venice to London received an unusual message. Refuel before you arrive. Not a weather warning, not a technical alert, a fuel warning. Venice Marco Polo Airport, one of Italy's busiest international hubs, was running low on jet fuel. And it was not alone. This is the story of the war in the Persian Gulf that arrived at Italy's airports. The story that was buried under the diplomatic headlines. The story that 60 million Italians felt before any speech or summit or poll told them what was happening. February 28th, 2026. The United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran. Within hours, Iran responded by effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil supply passes every day. Most Italians heard about the Strait of Hormuz as a foreign policy problem, a diplomatic crisis, something for leaders to manage in summits and phone calls and press conferences. Then April arrived, and the Strait of Hormuz arrived in Italy. April 2nd, Air BP Italia, one of Italy's main aviation fuel suppliers, the aviation division of the British energy group BP, issued an emergency NOTAM, a notice to airmen, the kind of bulletin that goes directly to airlines and pilots. The message was technical, but its meaning was unmistakable. Fuel rationing was now active at 4 northern Italian airports: Bologna, Milan Linate, Treviso, Venice Marco Polo. The restrictions were immediate. For short-haul flights under 3 hours, a maximum of 2,000 litres of jet fuel per aircraft, a fraction of normal requirements. For Venice, pilots were explicitly advised to refuel before arriving, because supplies on site could not be guaranteed. Priority was given to 3 categories only: medical flights, government flights, flights longer than 3 hours. For everything else, the Ryanair to London, the EasyJet to Barcelona, the ITA Airways to Frankfurt, a 2,000-litre cap. Think about what that number means. A typical short-haul aircraft burns around 2,500 to 3,000 litres per hour. A 2-hour flight to London requires roughly 5,000 litres for a safe journey with reserves. The rationing cap was cutting that in half. Airlines had 3 options: cancel flights, make unscheduled technical stops at other airports to refuel, or reduce passenger loads to fly with less fuel. None of those options are good for passengers, or for Italy's economy. By April 8th, 6 days after the first NOTAM, the crisis had spread. 7 airports were now affected: Bologna, Venice, Milan Linate, Treviso, Pescara, Reggio Calabria. And one more, the worst case, Brindisi. Brindisi Airport, in southern Italy's Puglia region, had not run low on fuel, it had run out. Complete fuel depletion. No commercial jet fuel on site. The airport was operationally dependent on emergency supplies from other locations. Brindisi ran dry. In Italy. In April 2026. At Rome Fiumicino and Milan Malpensa, Italy's 2 largest airports, a separate crisis was unfolding. A combined 286 disruptions were recorded. 271 delayed flights, 15 cancellations. ITA Airways, Ryanair, EasyJet, Lufthansa, British Airways, all affected. Routes to London, Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Madrid, New York, Tokyo, Dubai, all disrupted. 286 disruptions at 2 airports in 1 week. Ryanair's CEO Michael O'Leary spoke directly to Sky News. If the Iran war continues, jet fuel supplies could be disrupted across Europe by early May. Summer flights are at risk, not just in Italy, across the continent. But Italy was first, and Italy felt it first, because Italy is among the most energy-vulnerable countries in Europe. Before the Iran war, Italy imported approximately 38% of its gas from Russia, until 2022, when it began diversifying after the Ukraine invasion. It replaced Russian gas with Norwegian, Algerian, Azerbaijani and Qatari supplies. It invested heavily in LNG terminal capacity. It reduced Russian dependency to near zero by 2025. And then the Strait of Hormuz closed. Qatar supplies roughly 10% of Italy's gas. Gulf LNG tankers supply a significant portion of Italy's aviation fuel. The last tanker loaded with kerosene from the Persian Gulf arrived in Europe on April 9th. Everything after that would come via the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to supply chain timelines and costing significantly more. The numbers on the ground told the story. Diesel at €2.50 per litre across Italy, levels not seen since the 2022 energy crisis after Ukraine. Industrial electricity prices surging. 4 northern airports rationing fuel. 1 southern airport completely dry. 286 disruptions at the country's 2 largest hubs. And all of it caused by a war that Italy did not start, did not join, and did not want. Italy repudiates war. That sentence is in the Italian constitution. Meloni said it herself in Parliament. The opposition said it. 81% of Italians stood behind Meloni when she said the war was not Italy's to fight. But the war came anyway. Not as soldiers or bombs, as empty fuel tanks at Brindisi airport, as a 2,000-litre cap at Venice, as delayed flights at Fiumicino, as €2.50 at every petrol station in the country. This is how modern wars arrive. Not at borders, at airports, at petrol stations, at gas bills, at factory orders that can't be filled because energy costs have made production unprofitable. Giorgia Meloni went to the Gulf. She met the Saudi Crown Prince. She met the Emir of Qatar. She met the UAE President. She was the first European Union leader to visit the Gulf since the war began. She went because Italy needed energy, not because it was a diplomatic opportunity, because diesel was €2.50 and Brindisi Airport had no fuel. Then she came home and went to Paris, to build a coalition that would secure the Strait of Hormuz, permanently, defensively, without the United States. The summit in Paris was not just about shipping lanes. It was about the 2,000-litre cap at Venice Airport. It was about Brindisi running dry. It was about the Italian family that paid more to fill the car this month than last year. It was about the factory in Lombardy that cut its night shift because electricity costs made it unprofitable to run. The Iran war is a foreign policy story. It is a diplomatic story. It is a story about Trump and Meloni and the Pope and Paris summits. But first and most directly, for the people living in Italy in April 2026, it was a fuel story. It started on February 28th in the Strait of Hormuz. It arrived in Italy on April 2nd at Bologna, Milan Linate, Treviso and Venice. And by April 8th, Brindisi had no fuel at all. But there is one more number that the coverage missed entirely. The last tankers that departed Gulf ports before the Strait effectively closed have now reached their destinations. Everything behind them is rerouting via the Cape of Good Hope. 14 extra days, significantly higher costs, which translate directly into higher prices at every point in the supply chain, from the refinery to the airport to the petrol station to the family car. Summer 2026 is 10 weeks away. The tourist season that Italy depends on for a significant share of its GDP begins in June. If the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted, even partially, the aviation fuel situation at Italian airports could worsen precisely when it matters most. Meloni knows this. It is why she went to the Gulf before anyone else. It is why she went to Paris. It is why she offered Italy's navy to the Hormuz mission. The geopolitics and the fuel crisis are the same story. One beginning in diplomatic cables and summits and press conferences. the other ending at the petrol pump in Rome, the check-in desk in Venice, and the empty fuel tanks in Brindisi. Italy did not choose this war, but Italy is paying for it, every day, at every airport, at every petrol station. That is the story the headlines buried. Subscribe to the Record Room, because the next file is already open.